The following is an excerpt from the book The Storyteller of Algiers, written by Naceur Charles Aceval, illustrations by Bendix Bauer, English audio version by Hakim Aceval. Postface. My father, the Gastarbeiter, or guest worker. Alternative title: How the guest worker became a cook, the cook a philosopher, and the philosopher a storyteller. When my father asked me to write a postface for his newest books of stories, I was surprised and honored at once. And then I asked myself, what could you possibly write that does the task justice? What would a reader of this book find interesting? At first I found it difficult to sort my thoughts, but then a colleague asked me again that eternal question that people always ask when I talk about my father and his calling, that he has made into a job. Wow, you must have had a magical childhood full of fairy tales. I heard that question, by times in the form of an assumption, so often that I stopped to think about it consciously. But this time I realized to what degree my father's late calling had created an expectation with people, especially with all those people who only got to know him through his work as a storyteller, that he must always have been what he is now, a narrator and an artist. That explains why people are so surprised when I, truthfully and politely, negate their expectation. Yes, my childhood has been a magical one, but that was mostly the case because I made it a magical one myself. Of course, there was the one or odd tale from my father's mouth already back then. The fairy tale world in which I grew up as a child was indeed a mixture of Algerian, French, and German tales. There were the very peculiar tales my father sometimes told, and in contrast, the almost harmless tales of the Grimm tradition from my mother's side. These two traditions were guarded by French tales like Barbe Bleue, but also the fairy tales from Czechia and Slovakia, in a wonderful book belonging to my mother and mirroring the heritage of my mother's side grandfather, who was from Bratislava. That often presumed magic of my childhood mainly stemmed from my early love for fantastic stories and, later, the fantasy genre. The German fantasy author Wolfgang Holbein, the fighting fantasy books of Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, and especially the endless hours spent with classic pen and paper role-playing in the 1980s and 90s in the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons, and especially, in my case, The Dark Eye, were the ground pillars of my dream world, to which in my very early youth Tolkien, H.P. Lovecraft, and also more recent authors like Stephen King and many others were added. So, if not a storyteller, what was my father then in those years between my birth in 1975 and the beginning of his storyteller days around the years 2005, 2006? Well, at the very beginning, he was really a Gastarbeiter, which is a word that you would even find in an English dictionary, and that is sometimes translated as guest worker, but it's a German coinage. So, would he arrive in Germany today, as he arrived back in the early 70s, many would probably throw the "you're an economic migrant" or refugee insult at him. I still recollect vividly how he recounted repeatedly that Gastarbeiter, that word, was used as an insult at work by his foreman at the Mercedes-Benz assembly line during his factory worker years. At that time, I had a hard time actually to give a negative connotation to the word guest, and I had to be careful not to fall into a form of revenge racism and to presume collectively that all the Swabian Germans around us were racists? Well, legally, my father was a European equipped with a French passport, as he was born during a time when Algeria was still a département of France. A bit of history here. Between the years 1848 and 1962, so well over 100 years, the Département Français d'Algérie consisted of the three departments Alger, Oran, and Constantine. Present-day Algeria, so to speak. My father was born in April 1951, in the Department of Oran. And he is the son of a French Basque settler, on the one side, his father, and his mother, the daughter of the most respected nomad tribes in the whole region, the Ouled Sidi Khaled. So his birth happened shortly before the troubles of the Algerian War of Independence. That war raged between 1954 and 1962. So he was just born 3 years before the outbreak of the war. After the war, my father was 11 years old then. Algeria was an independent country. His father was dead, my grandfather, and the family who previously had owned farmlands were dispossessed. My grandmother had to raise her 6 children alone and under great poverty. They were despised as French from the Algerians and as Arabs from the French. It was very clear to all children to use the only perceived privilege of their birth, their French passports, as soon as possible and to emigrate to France. It was rather a question of when and not if. In fact, only one of the 6 remained in Algeria, and she married there and stayed there. My father arrived in Marseille in the early 1970s. He was in his very early 20s, poor, and from his looks, a typical North African Berber, an Arab in the eyes of the French. Occasional jobs, racism, and homesickness were constant companions. The France of the 1970s was worlds away from the Algeria of his childhood and youth. The luxury to get lost in books and fantasy worlds like his son would do later, he never had that. The only form of escapism he had during his youth were occasional movies in the town cinema, but especially the bloody gang wars of his hometown of Suger in the department of Tiaret. Of these gang wars, he would later tell episodes to his children, which were quite entertaining to listen to in the safety of a German village. Eventually, the French army conscripted him and sent him as a soldier to the French barracks in Reutlingen, which is in southwest Germany. It was there where he met my mother, and the rest is, as they say, history. Among the fond memories I have from the time when my father, after having worked for 7 long years as an unlearned worker at the assembly line at the Daimler factory, Mercedes-Benz factory, finally, thanks to a retraining, he practiced a real profession. So the fond memory I have from there is our long talks during and after dinner. My father always had been a very communicative person, and even back then he needed an audience. As worker, then employee, this consisted mainly of family and friends. Often we had visitors who didn't only come because of the French wine and the tasty food. My father had become an outstanding cook very early, but especially because of the witty discussions. But these also took place when we didn't have visitors and only us 4 were sitting at the table. In the intersection between the Christian faith of my mother and her family and the Arabic heritage, but without the religious luggage, because my father is quite a freethinker, it was very interesting for my sister and myself to talk and philosophize literally about God, the universe, and all the rest. From an early time on, I realized that my father was positively interested in my views. Be it during my astronomical phase, I was probably 10 years old, during which I love to speak about planets and space, that he always managed to lift that onto a philosophical level, about topics of both fascinating and hard to grasp for the human mind, like what is the nature of endlessness and infinity. So during these discussions, our discussions about things that were closer to the sociological questions of the time also arose. Racism, funny and thought-provoking episodes from work, which often were based on cultural differences among colleagues, political developments, the events around 1989, when the wall fell and communism disappeared, the changed order of the world, but also later topics like the assault on Iraq by the US and their allies, and the, from today's vantage point, ridiculous fear of some parents of my schoolmates of incoming Iraqi Scud missiles in our shire, that is the Swabian region of southwest Germany. People were actually afraid that the rockets would hit us, and they stored food in their cellar. Ridiculous. All these topics and much more were discussed at the dinner table. Often we sat for hours after dinner and completely forgot things like the TV program. I didn't realize it at the time, but my father went at that time through a very difficult but also a formative phase. After his first years in Germany, where everything stood under the sign of survival in the economic sense, but also in the sign of arrival, in that for him so foreign, often cold German society. As the Frenchman, he had often better possibilities to be accepted by his German colleagues at the car assembly line. He was different than, for example, his Turkish colleagues, because he could say, I'm French, and then he was invited to go out and have that after-work beer with the Germans. By times, being a Frenchie even gave him a positive, exotic nuance. Perhaps without knowing it, in those 1980s, my father actually laid the intellectual foundation stone for my future. It was the time where he poured a lot of energy in cooking, and where his relationship to the culinary world left the domain of being a mere hobby and developed into a fervent passion. Cookbooks were omnipresent in our house at that time. He didn't cook by recipe, never actually, but that would probably be against his nature as an artist. But during these years, he always had a cookbook in hand, even on the sofa while watching TV. Sometimes I was angry when I wanted to show him a movie and he was half the time in his cookbook. He soaked up everything from there, good ideas for recipes. He developed a sense of combining ingredients, trying out cooking techniques, and we were basically his guinea pigs, on the weekends especially. Based on this, he created his own recipes, which often led to the result that French or German recipes got Maghrebized by the usage of spices like cumin. One of his sayings from these days, in which already is reflected the builder of bridges between cultures that he should become later in life, was, when I'm in Germany, I make couscous. When I'm in Algeria, I make spätzle. Explanation, spätzle are a traditional South German Austrian egg noodle dish. So he used cooking also to build bridges already back then. The city libraries in the cities of Böblingen and Sindelfingen, this is basically our county. These city libraries were important centers for him. They allowed him to quench his thirst for cookbooks and later also other books. And one of his habits at that time was to take me and a good friend with him every Saturday when going into these towns to shop for food on the markets. He dumped us in the library while he went on a shopping tour that he always finished by hunting for books himself too, and then took us back home. It cannot be overstated how formative these weekly visits in the library were for my friend and myself. Around the ages of 8, 9, 10, and even later, we both developed a deep love for books and knowledge that never left us afterwards and opened many magical doors for us. There is also a clear correlation of us becoming later going to university and studying, which wasn't something that is easy for people with a working class background. So to this day, my friend and I, we get red eyes when we delve into the nostalgia of these library visits and the treasures we hunted down there as kids, in that universe of packed shelves full of mystery and promise. But my father, that gifted storyteller, Naceur Charles Aceval, what kind of person was he back then? And how was he doing during that time? Well, I wasn't aware of much of it. He simply, for me, was dad, and he worked as an electronics specialist for energy equipment at a small company in a nearby town. He left early in the morning, before 6, and came back late in the afternoon, mostly when I already sat on the sofa after school and watched the latest Star Trek Next Generation or Deep Space Nine episode with a coffee and some cookies. That's usually when he came back, and he always catched the end of Star Trek only. He was a gifted cook and had developed into a free-time philosopher. We are now in the middle of the 1990s, because after having learned the German language in the 70s, a profession and cooking in the 80s, his true thirst, his thirst for wisdom, couldn't be quenched. One of his habits had become to roam the flea markets of the wider area every weekend, searching for pearls among all of the civilization rubble on offer there. While his colleagues rarely touched books, the nature of books in our shelves had changed. The amount of cookbooks had diminished, and books from Schopenhauer or collections of aphorisms ranging from Ambrose Bierce to Erich Fromm, later also the ex-Catholic priest and theologist Eugen Drewermann, had now found their place in our living room. The cook had become a philosopher. Also, in the kitchen, he joked that the real purpose of cooking was alchemy. Cooking became a nearly magical act of creation and transformation. And like in the works of C.G. Jung, where psychological alchemy was symbolized by the kitchen, and where the kitchen is the symbolic place where unrefined metals, feelings, drives, are transformed into more noble states, cooking had become for my father much more than just the preparation of food. It had become a way, very much in the same sense in which East Asian martial arts use that word. Culturally, the preparation and the sharing of couscous at the nomads of the North African Maghreb region always had that other dimension. A ritualistic gesture of hospitality. And hospitality is sacred there. Being invited to share a meal always also was an invitation for communication and ultimately communion. Finally, the Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti and the Belgian chansonnier Jacques Brel had become the most important friends of my father. Krishnamurti's philosophy of truth as a pathless land and the vision of a human being that freed themselves from all ideology and had become fully present were often topics of our talks then. It was at that time, around my 18th birthday, that my father transformed from an authority figure and became a friend, a brother even. That didn't change to this day. And the tales, where are the fairy tales in all of this? The reader will ask now. Well, they didn't really play a part, would be the honest answer. Besides one very vivid memory where he told the tale of Habra, daughter of the lion, at the dinner table and made everyone cry, the tales of his ancestors were still dormant then. Growing up, being a teenager, and then a young adult, I never experienced my father as a storyteller, not in the form in which he now lives this role. This role is something he grew into. In hindsight, though, it cannot be denied that even if his path was not predetermined, it wasn't a complete surprise. The fairy tales, the wisdom stories and legends that my father tells today, I didn't hear many of them as a child. My favorite tale of his, on the other side, the tale is called Pepe Colosso, a fairy tale about a young man with superhuman strength and an unwavering moral compass who marries the princess in the end, even though his false friends betray him, one by one. This tale is not part of his repertoire today. And his trademark story about Habra, the daughter of the lion, that I mentioned just earlier, I must have already been 17 when I heard it for the first time. Of course, my father has always been a teller and a speaker. During family festivities, he was always the center of attention, and everyone, be it children, friends of the family, or the East Prussian great aunt, loved to talk and to joke with him. My father always loved that story about Diogenes, the philosopher, who was roaming the streets of the city in broad daylight, a lit lamp in his hand, proclaiming, "I am looking for a human being." I believe that he himself never consciously made the connection between the tales he inherited from his mother, grandmother, and other ancestors, and his search for truthfulness and wisdom among the people of his environment. It was up to his sister, Nora Aceval, who had taken a different, if similar, path in France, to confront him one day with the obvious. She had taken the route of studying French literature at university later in life, after having worked as a nurse for decades and earned a degree that allowed her to enter university in her free time. She had made her master thesis about the oral tradition of fairy tales and legends in the Maghreb region, and had become a researcher, a published author, and a storyteller of some renown in France. One day, in the early 2000s, she convinced my father to join her in his function of being the cook there for a days-long fairy tales and legends retreat in a Loire chateau, where France's most renowned storytellers gathered to exchange stories, techniques, and ideas. He prepared the meals and didn't expect anything else than cooking and listening to stories and spending time with his sister. That's when the plot twist was revealed. Innocently, the organizer of the event, Bruno de la Salle, asked my father, "We all enjoy your sister's stories and heritage, but I'm sure you must have some tales to tell as well. Why don't you indulge us in a performance of your own making tomorrow?" The first reaction was panic. Telling a story? Me? To all these pros? No, I'm the cook, I'm not a storyteller. It was the crossing of one of those magical thresholds in life that you can only traverse in one direction, and there's no going back afterwards. The floodgates were opened. My father started to tell tales, and he didn't stop ever since. The guest worker had become a cook, the cook a philosopher, and ultimately the philosopher had laid down the books and become a narrator. I myself witnessed this last step in my father's development from afar. During the first 2 years of his newly found profession, that really is a calling. The cooking and serving of his trademark Algerian couscous royal was still the centerpiece of the evenings people started to book him for. The tales were basically the dessert delivered after the meal, my father being in full Berber attire and serving his stories together with hot mint tea and Arabic sweets. Only around 2007, when I already migrated for work to Ireland, the focus of my father pivoted more and more towards the stories. We still worked together on the first version of his first novel, The Man That Didn't Want to Die, in the first half of 2007, before I left Germany in August that year. There was, though, one distinct advantage of following his activities and his growth from afar. As I was only able to experience his performances live once or twice a year, I realized how much he improved and grew each time, probably more than those physically closer to him. From the still insecure even surprised by his own success, narrator of his first days, nothing is left today. Charles today is a storyteller in full bloom, conscious of his strength and shortcomings, but at the same time fully aware of his responsibilities at each performance. The responsibility towards the words of his ancestors, but also towards his audience. When he takes them on the journey to people and events past, this always has to be a fresh, authentic experience and has to live up to the specific audience's needs. Despite having developed into a professional, he never lost his deep respect for the word. In this, his latest book now, that bears the title The Storyteller of Algiers, he once more compiled in writing some of his stories. This is always a difficult task, especially for someone stemming from an oral, living tradition. The stories in this collection are a successful foray through wisdom tales that Charles' audience surely is familiar with, but even for them, the one or odd new story should be found there. For me, his stories always double in value when I think about where they come from and what distance the narrator has covered since that time when the big Khaima, the main tent of the nomad tribe, of the nomads from the proud tribe of the Ouled Sidi Khaled, stood on the grounds of the French settlers Joachim Jean Aceval farm, and that uncommon anomaly that must have represented that marriage between this atheist and communist farmer and the Muslima daughter of the tribe's chief, an anomaly that was still possible in what seems now, from today's vantage point, like a pre-modern society. Possible because love and respect for the tradition of the other were more important than dogmatism and arrogance. Possible because the dream of a brother and sisterhood of people was still dreamed, even if only by a few. Possible because decency and honor still were self-evident virtues. But also possible because the world of fairy tales, the world of magic and possibilities, was still accepted as a possible option behind every bend of the way, and the value of human life still was a value in its own right. Until the next war, in that case the War of Independence, shattered all these virtues again like dust in the wind. And the fairy tales and dreams were shattered with them, exactly in the same way as every life is shattered since the beginning of time. But in the end, the word remains, and the word travels, and it always finds its way. Today, the word has arrived with you that hold this book in their hands. Hakim Aceval, Dublin, 14th of August, 2016. This is an excerpt from the book The Storyteller of Algiers, Stories from the Maghreb and Elsewhere, told and published by Naceur Charles Aceval in 2018. English audio version by Hakim Aceval, published with authorization and explicit encouragement of the author, illustrations and title image by Bendix Bauer. Currently, the book is only available in German. If you are an editor or interested in publishing an English version of the book, please contact the author's son, Hakim Aceval, under hakim@aceval.net. To order an autographed and dedicated copy of the book, please contact the author directly. You will find his email address under www.aceval.net or via his Facebook page.